Hi KIV teachers, welcome to the Maximinds Mental Healthcare webinar series. I'm really looking forward to the next 8 weeks with you, covering some really interesting topics and getting stuck into learning more about mental health, mental illness, and tools and strategies that can really help you as teachers in the classroom. So a reminder as to what we're covering in the next 8 weeks, starting today with Mental Health 101. And then we'll move through to mental illness, warning signs, strengths, interests, and values, and then going on to go through strong connections, self-awareness, prevention, and extra support and help. So to start with today, we'll get straight into it. We'll just start with going through a bit of an introduction. So firstly, what are we going to learn about today? Well, the key things that I would like for you to learn by the end of today is what is mental health, what causes positive mental health, why is mental health important, and how do we promote mental health in students. To break that down, we've got about 10 parts, starting with definitions as to what is mental health, what causes it, why is it important, and then as to how we can help our students in the classroom. And then we go into 3 different bits of that, which is about the being in control, being in the present moment, and also in touch with reality. Then we'll summarise and I'll go through and give you some resources to head to as well. So just before we get into that, I will ask you again to please get up your phones and scan the QR code. We, again, just have a few quick questions as to where your abilities are at now in terms of those topics around what we're going to cover today, being what is mental health, what causes positive mental health, why is mental health important, and how do we promote mental health in students. So if I just give you about a minute to grab your phones and please answer those 4 quick questions, that would really be great. Thank you if you've already completed that. I really appreciate that. And it's also going to help you to assess your own ability, and hopefully your understanding develops throughout this particular session, and we can compare that at the end as well for your own understanding. So to get into the first topic of today, which is the definitions, what is mental health really? So I thought I'd start with the World Health Organization. And they define it as a state of mental well-being that enables people to cope with the stresses of life, realise their abilities, learn well and work well, and contribute to their community. I've highlighted those couple of words in yellow there just because they're the sorts of things that we will be covering throughout the webinar series. The next sentence goes into why it's an integral part of our lives and how it underpins our individual and collective abilities to, in particular, make decisions, build relationships, and shape the world we live in. And it's also crucial to personal, community, and socio-economic development. And again, those are highlighted as potential outcomes of having good mental health. And that's important in thinking about those sorts of things for your students. And ultimately, mental health is a basic right, which I think brings home just how important it is that it should be accessible to everyone in the world. And how does Kinkoppel define mental health? So as you may be familiar, the students at Kinkoppel are using this Self Plus wellbeing framework, which is underpinned by positive psychology. The key things here in terms of the social emotional learning to flourish framework are positive emotion, engagement, relationships, meaning, accomplishment, and health. You can also see on the right here how that understanding of the self and beyond develops as they go throughout their senior school at Kincoppal. And similarly to what we just read about from the World Health Organization, interestingly, that KRB in years 11 and 12 and beyond start to really think about the self in relation to the world. So I think it just goes to show that what Kincoppal's obviously already doing is right on point with what's important in this space and why these are important concepts for you to learn about and to help your children to be mentally healthy. And then how do we define it at Maximinds? So this is a 3-part dimension that we've come up with on mental health and what are the 3 components that are really important that we found based on working with young people throughout the last few years. The first one being having a sense of being in control. So this is really important for young people to have that sense of autonomy and self-esteem and a perception that they've got choices and they've got the ability to control their choices. The second dimension is about having presence and being in the present moment. So really being in touch with what's happening right now as opposed to dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. And the third dimension is about reality and really being in touch with what's happening around themselves and also what's going on in the world that's real as opposed to distorted or made up, which is often quite important as well because of the need to differentiate between thoughts and feelings and emotions that are realistic and that are genuinely warranted from something and ones that are less so and less helpful in terms of impacting the way they feel. We're going to explore a little bit more as to how we can apply these dimensions and also ways to be mentally healthy throughout as we go when I talked about that how section of today's webinar. But before we get into that, we're going to go through a bit more around what actually causes mental health. So in terms of what causes mental health, you would have all been familiar, no doubt, with the nature versus nurture debate. I remember being taught it actually in Year 7 at Kincoppal for the first time, and it still applies now to obviously many things, but mental health being one of them. So nature is obviously the understanding that it's a genetic component if we're mentally well and have more likely to have those tendencies to be healthy. There's also factors, part of nature is neurobiological, so also suggesting that we've been born with either a healthier mind or not. And of course, on the other side of the argument is the nurture debate. And I think this speaks more to a growth mindset and gives us the understanding that we can grow and develop our mental health and well-being over time. And these are more things like environmental factors, things like the impact of family dynamics and a stable home life, and also the way that young people and our students and therefore children at home are nurtured really at home. It can also be from influences such as their peers socially, but also the impact that you have as teachers in impacting that nurture. And I really do think that's a big one. Obviously, they come down to both, that underlying genetic predispositions will always be there. And then I think the more important thing to focus on is, again, what we can control, which is the nurture element. And I think this does have such a big impact because of things like the ability for people and children to pick up by osmosis and role model off you as teachers, but also learn from the environments that they're in order to help promote their mental well-being. So this is all very well, but why is being mentally healthy and well important? I thought I'd start with a few potential feelings that you might be able to relate to, as I have heard these comments from people when seeking feedback and people being teachers in the past. And as part of developing this, I thought it'd be good to empathise with you as well, to understand that it might not always be a priority, but I want to show you why I think it is. So these have been some quotes, as I said, from teachers that I've heard before, that mental health is not a priority for my students. Self-care is self-indulgent. And my students have everything they need, so their mental health should be fine. And I think these do reflect not only these quotes in isolation, but they do reflect sometimes the perception around mental health and the stigma that is there, which is still very real, and that's part of society, and that's, obviously what we're trying to change. But it's just, I think, seeing these on the paper and on the page, you can really see that it's not necessarily regarded as a priority, and for obvious reasons, and we'll go into, I think, why that might be. This whole thought that this generation is self-indulgent, it's all a little bit, do they really need days off? Because, that's a bit, selfish, and that's all just part of that generation. My students have everything they need, and mental health should be fine. Again, I think this is interesting in the context of what I'm going to show you in a moment about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But ironically, it's sometimes when people do have everything, that they're looking for that's what's next, and it's counterintuitive in some ways, but the rate of mental illness in the Western world is obviously a lot higher than in the Eastern world. And I think that's probably a myth that we should bust as well. So just some food for thought. I also want to give you personally some food for thought, and I think let's think about this as how do we think about mental illness for ourselves versus physical illness. So we all go to our doctors, of course, for our physical health, and that's I'm going to assume that everyone does have a doctor, or has at least been to a doctor. And I guess the flip side of that is, so what are we doing for our mental health? And why is it that our brains aren't necessarily as important in fostering as our rest of our bodies, when it is our arguably most important organ? And why is that? And again, I think this goes back to more stigma. So that's something just also to think about. And in the same vein as teachers, I think when students are in the infirmary, or sent there, that's quite a different feeling and sentiment to say if they're seeing a school counsellor, which of course you may not know about, but it's just this underlying divide between physical and mental health that I think is just worth considering. I do want to go back to the World Health Organization's definition of mental health as a basic human right, just because I think this touches on what I was mentioning before and wanted to go into about Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in this case, before it's even a need, it's actually a fundamental right. So I think that's worth calling out, that's how critical the WHO finds it. And when I go through this, and I don't know how many of you would be familiar with Maslow's hierarchy of needs, but just to give you an overview, this is a theory that as you go up the pyramid, you have increasing or higher order needs, and it's not until you can almost meet those basic needs, for example, the physiological needs, that you can then move on to safety needs, and then social needs and esteem needs, and then self-actualization. So when I was talking just before about that perception that when everyone has everything that they need, and of course, your students and the girls are very lucky to go to an excellent school and have teachers like you, that why would they have anything to worry about, or why would they have mental illness? It's perhaps ironic and counterintuitive, but because they're striving for those higher order things like self-actualization, then that can create a bigger dissonance and create more disparity between their sense of achievement and what they've got and what they don't have, and they're still striving towards. And of course, finding your self-actualized need, which is ultimately finding your ultimate purpose in life, or what are you meant to do, or who are you meant to be, is something that our girls are fortunate enough to even consider the possibility of. But of course, it's much harder to attain that, and that the theory states that only 10% of people in the world even get to that stage of self-actualization. So I guess to summarise here, the key things have been that not only mental health is a right, but it's also a need. And these sorts of things in mental health, esteem obviously is part of that. And that self-actualization is really that meaning and purpose, which I think is where it sits up there. So that's just something to think about as why it's so fundamental and why it's so relevant also to our girls at Kincoppal. Now I want to show you this, and I did mention before that I'll talk about, well, if we're striving for excellence and success, what does that really look like at a high achieving school such as Kincoppal, and what does really success look like? I'm assuming the goal and the priorities, and this goes back to that comment before made about mental health's not a priority, and I think, well, this is perhaps why, is because, of course, results is what matters to a school, and at an overview, obviously, that's why students are there to learn and do well and excel. And the perception, perhaps on the surface, is that, well, how do you get there? It's, yes, there's an element of IQ, and go back to that nature debate, and then there's the element of nurture, the hard work. And yes, I think they're two definite factors that can contribute. But the reason we picked the logo, well, the reason why Maximinds is designed in the way it is because it sits not only on 2 blocks, it's actually a whole lot of these, what we'd honestly call building blocks or foundational blocks that help students to achieve. And as you can see here, there's a whole lot of other things that probably also, you would agree, go into doing well. Things like socialising, self-esteem, a sense of belonging, emotional regulation, grit, growth mindset, and resilience, which are all under the mental health banner. And I do use this blocks without the words for clients to explain that it takes a lot of blocks to get to where you want to be. It's not just the hardworking academics and the intellect. I think it's all that other stuff that goes in, and beyond these things that perhaps you could do in the classroom. Of course, there's another whole layers that are relevant to things at home life, like, having a stable, secure home, making sure they're getting enough sleep, exercise. Those things, obviously, you can't control, but they're the sorts of things I'm speaking to the parents about as well, which are also all contributing in different ways to mental health. I also just wanted to add, just to hear and how I can back up this claim that the mental health is so fundamental to getting that success, is there was a meta-analysis done back in 2011, which looked at a group of students who went through a social emotional learning program similar to the Self Plus at Kincoppal, and they found, out of looking at about 300,000 students, those that went through the program ranked 11 percentage points higher than those who didn't. So I think, again, it's not just good for because it's a right and because it's a need, and it's a fundamental health is important, but it's actually good for the academics as well. And that's just another reason as to why I think, why the literature says and the research says it's such a priority. Just to go back again to the World Health Organization, I pulled out these other things that I mentioned before around making decisions, building relationships, shaping the world they live in, and also having that crucial component of the personal, community, and socioeconomic development as all outcomes of good and positive mental health. I guess they're just other reasons, which it's not just even within the school framework. It's that last panel that you've got in the Self Plus model, which goes what happens outside of the classroom, above and beyond school, what happens post-school. And these are the outcomes that obviously positive mental health happens that don't just stop at in Year 12. So they, as they've said, and the research also shows, those with high mental well-being and health make better decisions, healthier relationships. Literature says they have fewer divorces and greater marital satisfaction as well, which is obviously good for our future girls. Also better social contributors, as we saw, they're able to think outside themselves and engage in a world that's bigger than them. And as well, just to add to the list of reasons why mental health is important, they'll also have a higher income on average for those that do have mental health rather than those that don't. So that's a lot about the background and the theory as to why mental health, what is mental health, what causes it, and why it is important from the research, but also from obviously my own work with girls and boys that are in these teenage years, which I think are so fundamental and crucial to setting them up for success, not only at school, but above and beyond that. But how does this apply to you, and how can I give you some strategies to actually put this into practice? So what are the sorts of things practically that you can do to help your girls and students with their mental health? And we're not expecting, obviously, for you to take ownership as their psychologists and counsellors. All that, what I'm interested in and what I hope is most helpful to you is giving you the really practical, short, 1 minute maximum things that you can help build as habits and help them to direct them to sources that they can access. So, as we go through this webinar series, you'll see that from the 4th, 5th, 6th and 7th webinars, we have more specific things as to how we can start looking at promoting mental health and well-being, such things as looking into their strengths, interests and values. And again, I know you already do a bit of that at Kinkoppel with the Self Plus and looking at VIA character strengths and things like that, extending that. Other things that we'll talk about is strong connections, as we saw, having good relationships as both a predictor of and a outcome for positive mental health is really important, and having those good, strong connections. And how do you do that? Again, in real time in practice. How do you listen, validate and respond all in almost a couple of sentences to make it really practical for you? And then also the self-awareness, understanding your own teaching styles and your own position as amazing role models for the girls, but also how that could be impacting in a positive way their own mental health. And then also looking at prevention strategies. So they're more, we'll go into depth as to how to do that. But what I did want to do, given I've given you now this framework that we use already, I wanted to give you some practical strategies based on these 3 dimensions that I showed you earlier. So about being in control, being in the present moment, and also being in touch with reality. What are things that you can do to do this? Because this is all quite theoretical for now, but what does that actually look like? So to go through, firstly, in terms of control, how do you elicit a sense of control in your students so that to help them feel mentally well and healthy? You may already have a few ideas or want to brainstorm yourself, but do think about how can you really empower them, even at a micro level in a day-to-day basis in the classroom. So for control, the thing for them would be really to help, the thing for you would be really to help them feel like they've got a sense of control and ownership that they can be empowered by. So really simple things like controlling their breath, for example, talking to them or helping them with even taking a big breath out to reduce their heart rate down. That's something that they can control. They can control, to a certain extent, how they wear their hair in the morning to school. They can control what they wear on the weekend. They can control how much study they do. They can control, in the later years particularly, which subjects that they get to choose. So giving them that sense of ownership really is helpful to them, particularly as they're growing through those higher years at school. And how can you even inject that sense of control in the earlier years? So that might just be something more to think about. I'm going to give you some strategies, as I just mentioned, that second one there, the breathing out before in. I think it's worth raising this. This is just a bit of a general mental health strategy. And of course, we're always told to take deep breaths in. But I think it's important to know that science says, and I'm sure there's far more qualified science teachers here, but breathing out reduces the oxygen in your body, which then helps to reduce your heart rate. So counter to what we're told with taking in deep breaths, help them to breathe out. And then that's a way to even control their own bodily functions. So you can control their heart rate. For example, when they might be panicked or stressed or anxious, helping them to breathe out is a way that they can then feel, okay, I can get my breath back and control my heart rate, which is quite empowering to them. What I do want to do is show you a strategy, a cognitive behavior therapy strategy. I would just bring that up and let you watch that.
Mental well-being is about recognizing what is within our control. As teachers, you can guide students to engage in a control circle activity. You start this activity by drawing a circle and having them identify and write down what is within their control inside the circle. You can also get them to write stuff that is outside of their control, outside of the circle. By focusing their energy on what they can control and accepting what is beyond their control, students can experience a greater sense of autonomy and promote their.
So as you've just seen, the control circle is quite a practical strategy that you could do within a minute with a student or give it to them in class, just to really get it down on paper. We've also got some activities online that you can access, and you can print these off or email them to them to do, to help them not be so overwhelmed and really focus their attention back into what they can control, because that is very empowering. Another downloadable activity we have is the to-do and ta-da. The to-do being we're obviously all used to, very familiar with what we have to do, but we don't stop and think enough about what, ta-da, we've achieved for that day. And I think that goes back to what we were talking about earlier around the self-actualization and that thriving need to try and find out, what's they've achieved or what they want to do or be. So another quick strategy might be doing a to-do and ta-da with the students, which involves getting them to write down, say, 3 things that they want to do just in that class alone. So that might be, for example, do chapter 5.4 maths questions, mark homework from yesterday's maths homework, for example. Then at the end of the session, the class, you could also just get them to write down, well, what did they achieve? And these don't necessarily have to be what they've actually done and ticked off. They might be, but they might be, oh, well, I didn't do the 5.4 activity, but I have started my maths revision and did a past paper or something. So it's just good for them to help them think, again, what's in their control and what they're progressing towards, rather than having endless to-do lists and being overwhelmed. So the next dimension is about having a sense of present, or being in the present moment. Quite simplistically, typically mental illness sits in the ruminating in the past, which is often where depression can lie, or worrying about the future, which is typically where anxiety sits. And we'll look more at those in detail next week. But most important thing to note here is that mental health sits with being in the present moment. So what does that look like for you? For example, it might be helping students to really focus on what can they do on that day, in that lesson, in that specific class in history on period 4 Tuesday, rather than thinking, okay, what are they going to do for their major modern history extension work in year 12? So helping to really shift their focus into being in the present. Again, I would encourage you to think about other ways you can help them to focus on just this next hour versus this whole next year or this whole schooling experience, which often is where the catastrophizing can happen and mental health goes down. So a couple of strategies for you here. The first one is, of course, mindfulness, meditation. And I know there's a bit of a stigma against that, and particularly obviously for children who just discount it and think it's not worthwhile. But that is, I think, if you had to pick one technique to do on the whole for someone's mental health and well-being, it is mindfulness meditation, because it does capture not only helping them to be in the present, but also helps them to focus on the control and also be more in touch with reality. So if there was nothing else, this is the one to focus on, and it's about building it as a habit. I think the aversion to it is because you do have to sit still and try and not think, which is not necessarily the case. It's more about how do you tune into the present moment and helping them to do that. I will show you a video as to what this could look like and a strategy that you could apply in class, and really using the comfort of your familiar voice, which would be comforting to them, is probably just as good or better than my voice, for example. So I would encourage this as something to think about, and I'll just play that for you.
As teachers, you can guide students in practicing mindfulness meditation. Teach them to close their eyes and focus on their thoughts, emotions, and bodily sensations. Encourage them to acknowledge these experiences without judgment or attachment. Guide them through a full body scan where they pay attention to different parts of their body, relaxing each area as they go. Then prompt them to bring their awareness back to the present moment by opening their eyes and engaging their senses. Encourage them to notice what they see, hear, touch, taste, and smell in their environment. Regular mindfulness meditation practice helps students develop a sense of self-awareness, manage stress, and cultivate mental well-being.
So hopefully that technique shows you a little bit more about how mindfulness can actually be practical and quite useful. And as we know, our brains are neuroplastic, and particularly children's brains. They are constantly evolving and developing at rates, frankly, quite much faster than our brains. But this is a skill that you can help them to learn over time, and it really does help them to increase their ability to be more present, which is the most important thing to help with their mental well-being. Other strategies that you might want to download, for example, is this be present activity for them. You can print them out or give it to them. And it gets them to write it down on paper, which is what is happening right now. The reason we also have these activities and things like this is because it's all very well for them to think about, well, what's happening right now. But when you put it on paper, it increases the objectivity of what's happening and removes some of that emotion and all those extra feelings that go with it. So always encouraging to write down, and this is why things like journaling is also very good and found to have great utility for mental health, because it's about putting it on paper and helps with the mental well-being. And the third and last dimension of mental health is, of course, being in touch with reality. And this, again, is something I would encourage you to think about. How can you help them to be more in touch with reality in the classroom? And I will share some ideas. The thing with this one is really helping to be in this universe rather than another one. And while that seems quite meta, it's making sure that they're actually able to think realistically. And again, that objective thinking can help remove some of the emotion that comes with typically mental illness and having thoughts and feelings which are uncomfortable and can lead to those sort of spirals and catastrophizing. So I will again show you a couple of techniques. The first one is to help that rational thinking and objectivity and getting to the most likely case scenario. For this one, we do the worst case and then the best case in order to get to the most likely case scenario. So getting them to write down the worst case is obviously much more intuitive and easy for someone that's not as mentally well. That's that catastrophizing and thinking about what's going to go wrong. It's very hard for them to ask, well, what's most likely actually going to happen, because they're not quite framed in that way yet. And that's why we put the best case in the middle to help them to get to that jump to be more rational and in touch with reality. So I'll show you a video to explain that further.
Teachers can guide students in managing anxiety and catastrophic thinking by practicing the worst, best, and most likely approach. Encourage them to consider 3 perspectives: the worst case scenario, the best case scenario, and the most likely outcome. By considering the best case scenario, they tap into optimism and hope. Then by evaluating the most likely outcome, they ground themselves in reality and reason. This exercise helps balance their thoughts and emotions, reducing anxiety and promoting a more rational mindset. By engaging in more rational and balanced thinking, students can develop resilience, alleviate anxiety, and promote their mental well-being. Teachers can guide students.
And again, another activity for them to do and for you to give to students, which is on paper. So this is an extension of that reality and being absorbed in what's actually happening right now. And engaging senses, I think, is very powerful for grounding. And even going one step further is to write these things down can help them focus even on that pen and paper and what's happening. So it might be naming 5 things that they can touch, 4 things they can see, 3 things they can hear, 2 things they can smell, and 1 thing they can taste. That can help them to reorient them into reality. This may seem like a useless exercise for some, but for example, if they're doing something like English creative writing as well, this would help them to become more attuned to noticing different things. I think it will help, and we know it does help. Grounding and being engaged with the senses is good for creativity and things like that as well. So also advantageous for the art teachers here, and I'm sure it's got other applications for others, but most importantly, it's going to help with mental health, and that might be something to use for when people and children are feeling particularly anxious or stressed or overwhelmed, is just to get them to reorientate as almost like a circuit breaker. So that takes us to the end of the content for today. What I'll go through now is a summary of what we did today. So at a high level, mental health is 3 things that we define as is being present, in control, and in touch with reality. So those 3 dimensions which orient children into in a person dimension, in a time dimension, also a space dimension, can help them be focused and help actually also improve things like concentration and problem solving and ability to be less distracted and things in class. It's caused by obviously both nature and nurture factors, and you're having the huge role here of nurture. And as I mentioned, in some ways, nature, by doing things like mindfulness, which can engage their neuroplastic brains, which can help them to rewire some of those ways that we do focus our time and more back into the present. So arguably a little bit of an impact then in helping to rewire their brains, that neurological benefits. Mental health is important because, as we've realised, it's a human right and need, and it also results in better outcomes. So both academically, but also throughout life. And it also, mental health can be promoted by helping students to be present, in control, and in touch with reality. And I've just given you a sample of ways that can be done, but I'm sure you'll have even more ideas as how that could happen. And as we go through these webinars, there will be more tools that are specific for different types of illnesses and different types of situations and circumstances. But that'll at least give you a high level overview. I would love if you can go back on and scan the QR code just to give me some indication as to where your abilities are at now, and also to reflect for yourself as to what you think you have learned today, also what you haven't. If you would like any further clarification, there's an opportunity to pop that in there, which is just optional, but please do give us this feedback, because it'll help to understand what's been useful and what's not. I'll just give you 30 seconds for that before we go into the final resource section. Okay, thank you for doing that, and hopefully you can also reflect on what you've been able to take away from today. In terms of resources as to where to hear and in between the weekly webinars, firstly, emergency contacts. Obviously, you're across these, but always good to have on hand, particularly when working with the students. There's further resources on Maximinds, and that does have then obviously 24/7 access, real-time support, all evidence-based, as I've mentioned throughout. Cognitive behaviour therapy is what we're grounded in, and that's scientific tools, and it can help you in the classroom in real time. As I just mentioned before, we will keep going into the more specifics, strategies and tools and things like that to help according to different mental illnesses themselves. And also there's the option there to refer to a psychologist. But of course, you've also got the KRB counselling team. And lastly, again, my contact details and are there, and a code to go and log on if you would like to give any further feedback or any other thoughts. But my email and phone number is always there. And thank you very much all for attending today, and looking forward to the next 7 weeks. Thank you.